Of the very many instruments that I've showcased on this channel in its 7.5 years of existence, this one that we're going to look at today might truly take the cake for the absolute weirdest one thus far. It looks like a fusion dance of several modern instruments that one might readily think of, and it doesn't play quite like any one of them. And there's nothing I can say to truly describe it to you or prepare you for it, so I'm afraid you'll just have to stick around to learn more. How's it going, everybody? It's your host, Sam, here from the Samuel Plays Brass channel, as per usual. I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you'll stick around because the subject of today's video, the OPHICLEIDE, is a truly special one. I'm hoping that this inevitably long and rambly video will serve several purposes. Firstly, to act as somewhat of a primer for anyone henceforth unfamiliar with the OPHICLEIDE and its history, and secondly, the more typical review thing that we do on this channel, although this instrument's far too old and weird for me to review in any objective sense, so we'll call it a show and tell. The marvelous beast that is the subject of this video was owned by the late and great Leonard Byrne. Leonard brought this instrument into Clearwater Music in the summer of 2022 to have it serviced prior to a big performance he was doing with it, and that's when the playing clips in this video are from, summer of 22, over a year and a half ago. You'll notice Sam looks a little bit baby-faced, kind of ratty-looking facial hair, and having sat on that footage for a year and a half at this point and done nothing with it, there was obviously already a plan in place to get this video done and flushed out of the system as soon as possible. But on a rather heavier note, I received a second reason to get it done just recently, where earlier this week we received news that Leonard has ended his 48-year tenure with the Spokane Symphony to go join the great orchestra in the sky. To put it into perspective, 48 years, that's close to as long as my parents have been alive and more than double the time I've spent on this earth thus far. There is not enough I could say about Leonard Byrne to do him justice. There is one small clip of him playing on my channel, and it's in my 2022 Tuba Christmas video. You can find that in the card if you want, but it's a quick clip of him playing a solo on what I believe is a late 1800s E-flat helicon, very squirrely sort of instrument. And that truly does not do justice for the rich, enormous bass tones that he filled the Martin Woldson Theater with for 48 years of his life. I suppose the best thing that I personally can say to Leonard's credit is that in those 48 years of being the Spokane Symphony's principal tubist, he was never formally a musician by trade, and he stood for everything that I want to accomplish with my life, which was a flourishing career in the engineering industry where he helped people day in and day out, and then still had enough time in his life left to inspire people with his music making. And as some of you might know, that's exactly the mission I seek with my life. Although I don't exactly strive to be an orchestral tubist, I do want to use my music in whatever way I can to supplement an engineering career and inspire whoever I can. And so what he did was truly something that was special to me. I wish I'd gotten to know him better and gotten to pick his brain a little bit more. It's debatable as to whether Spokane, Washington's music scene will ever again be the same without Leonard Byrne, but I just wanted to get this out of the way to mention that I'd like to dedicate this video to him and honor his legacy in whatever meager capacity I can. Now, apologies for the tonal whiplash, but that is all the emotion I can bring myself to show on camera in one night. So we're instead going to start talking about some of the history of the OPHICLEIDE, and I hope you'll also pardon the fact that I'm consulting my notes much more closely than I usually do. I'll usually have the computer sitting behind my phone, but although I flip my eyes to it once in a while, I more or less vaguely have memorized what I want to say about a particular instrument, at least in between takes. This instrument is so zany and so far out of my wheelhouse or comfort zone that I'm not freestyling this video to nearly the same extent. So unfortunately, this will be a little bit more like reading off of a PowerPoint slide than most of my videos, but again, I hope you'll pardon that. Anyway, the OPHICLEIDE, without further ado, was developed in France in the year of 1817, though it didn't receive its patent until 4 years later, and it was developed by the Frenchman Jean... I don't speak French, I'm not going to try that. Be that as it may, our friend John, however you pronounce the rest of his name, developed the OPHICLEIDE as an extension of the keyed bugle family. Back then, brass instruments did formally exist, but didn't have valves in the same sense that we know and love today. They instead, at a maximum, had keys like a woodwind instrument, which is really interesting. And some of the most famous solo literature of the day, such as the Hummel Trumpet Concerto, was written for these keyed bugles. And what the OPHICLEIDE then accomplished was it expanded the keyed bugle family of instruments into the bass register, where there was quite a dearth of any sort of brass presence. The most common OPHICLEIDEs were considered bass pitched at the time, which was 8-foot C or 9-foot B flat, Now this is a little bit different from modern convention where C or B flat tubas are actually double the length of their respective OPHICLEIDE key, but back then that was considered the base standard. And in fact, if you take a look at the French C tuba, it actually is an 8-foot C rather than a 16-foot C that we know and love today. So more like the modern euphonium in that sense. Things weren't as big or bulky or unwieldy as they are today. However, the patent for the OPHICLEIDE also included drawings for OPHICLEIDEs in alto F or E flat, or the quintoclave as it was known. This is much rarer, and it was much less useful because, like I said, the main dearth of the brass family in the orchestra was in the lower register, where they really needed something to round out the sound. And another thing that our good friend Jean intended of the OPHICLEIDE was for it to take the place of the historic instrument known as the serpent. The serpent was a brass-adjacent instrument, we'll say, that had been in use since the Renaissance period. It's really not a lot like any modern brass instrument, except for the fact that it took a cup mouthpiece, which basically every brass instrument does by definition. But it, as the name would suggest, was basically a serpentine tube that was coiled up in a way that where the holes were drilled in to change the pitches on the instrument, you would line your fingers up and cover or uncover those holes accordingly. And of course, this was an absolute ergonomic nightmare because the physics of the tube had no regard for the size or shape or spread of your fingers. The holes had to be drilled in where they had to be drilled in for the instrument to play in tune. So I bet with little fingers like mine, I'd have a hard time even wrapping my hands around the serpent and getting it to play in tune. Something fun about the OPHICLEIDE, and fairly related, is the fact that its name translates from Greek to serpent with keys. And that's essentially what it was. It was the serpent's replacement, and less of an ergonomic nightmare, although still not excellent, by way of having keys with levers rather than just straight up finger holes. And this sort of centralizes all the finger work on the instrument. With the tone holes drilled into the correct place, you can have basically paddles and lever systems that bring everything a little bit closer to you and allow you to not have to spread your fingers so far. And of course, the OPHICLEIDE maintained the similar cup-shaped mouthpiece that was used on the serpent. So overall, pretty similar, just lengthened and made less nightmarish to hold. The OPHICLEIDE saw virtually all of its use in the Romantic period and in opera music. It was written for by composers like Mendelssohn, who was one of its earliest admirers, also Berlioz, Wagner, and Verdi. Here's something fun. When valves first hit the scene for brass instruments in the mid-1800s, I think around the 1840s, OPHICLEIDEs were made on occasion with Vienna-style valves, and they look really interesting. And there are some pretty significant acoustical consequences to the instrument having cylindrical valve slides as opposed to opening tone holes to change the overall length of the instrument. And I imagine they'd probably play a little bit better than keyed OPHICLEIDes, but nonetheless, the OPHICLEIDe's heyday in general was very short-lived. The first tubas were developed in the 1830s, and honestly, by the 1860s, very few people were still in favor of the OPHICLEIDE over the tuba. The tuba took the stage pretty quickly. Now let's talk about this particular OPHICLEIDE and some of its features. We don't, first of all, have a date of manufacture, but luckily the window of time in which OPHICLEIDes were manufactured in the mainstream is pretty narrow, and we can hazard a pretty good guess at the fact that this thing was probably not built before the 1820s, and probably not after the 1860s. I believe when Leonard came to the shop and talked to my boss and me, I think he mentioned something like 1850s or even like American Civil War era type origins. Not entirely sure there, obviously. The instrument actually has its original cup mouthpiece, which we ended up lacquering over the rim and cup of very thinly, just to make it a little safer to play on. And this mouthpiece, I would say, is most similar to a small shank trombone or euphonium piece, with some obvious differences. For instance, the fact that the rim is extremely narrow and its surface is mostly flat, kind of in keeping with mouthpieces of this period. The cup of the mouthpiece I would consider about a medium depth V. It's nothing particularly deep, and it has a slightly narrower shape to it than a lot of more bowl-shaped mouthpieces that we see today. So overall, not a terribly high volume cup. Again, mouthpieces were not nearly as big back then as they are now, relatively speaking. And also the throat of this mouthpiece, I think, is fairly narrow. Something interesting about this instrument is the fact that it has basically a conical bore all the way through, at least past the mouthpiece receiver, although there's obviously very little flare at the bell, like you would see on a modern brass instrument. But overall, I would say the bore profile is most similar to something like a bari sax, honestly. So we've got a euphonium mouthpiece on a bari sax body that's been elongated and shaped like a bassoon. What a combination. This particular OPHICLEIDE is in 9-foot B-flat, much like your typical modern garden variety trombone, baritone, or euphonium. And it's got several levers operated by each hand. I can't remember the exact number of keys on this instrument, but typically OPHICLEIDEs had 9 to 12. The earlier ones would just have the normal 9, and then the other 2 to 3, depending on the instrument, were added later on to mitigate some of the intonation tendencies of the existing 9 keys. And let's talk about sort of the lowdown of what's going on with keys, especially because I think most of my audience are brass players and might not be terribly literate on what it is that keys and levers and tone holes actually do. So, on the OPHICLEIDE, most of the tone holes are closed by default, like that. Then you press a key, and they open. And that shortens the effective length of the instrument because you're opening it up a further distance away from the actual bell of the instrument and not getting the full length to resonate, and that produces a higher pitch. So essentially, as you work your way down the fingers towards the bottom, essentially, which is your right hand pinky, you're raising the pitch because you're using less and less of the instrument. There is one exception to this, and it's very bizarre. The left index finger on this instrument actually operated a key that closed the largest of all the tone holes. And what that did was it lowered the fundamental pitch of the open instrument, what I mean by open is no keys pressed, from its fundamental of B-flat to an A, a half step below. And an interesting consequence of this is the fact that when you're playing the open horn, again the B-flat horn, the actual bell of the instrument up here is not doing much for you acoustically. The A tone hole is the effective bell of the instrument because that's kind of where the resonance has to stop. You've opened that point in the instrument. So it's interesting that the actual bell of the instrument doesn't do too much unless you're specifically playing an A. Now, each tone hole produces a certain note as its fundamental. For instance, I think it was the left thumb or maybe the left thumb combined with the middle finger or something like that, that produced the note C. And its fundamental pitch was a C2 in piano terms, which is 2 ledger lines below the bass staff. But you wouldn't just be able to play a C2 on it. You'd be able to play the C2, you'd be able to play the C3 in the bass staff, the G3 above that, the C4, which is your typical piano middle C, the E and the G above that. Typically not much more. Unfortunately, the instrument didn't do very well in the upper register, but that was the case for each of the tone holes producing a different note. And so the fact that each tone hole has its own harmonic series for its respective fundamental, and the fact that the tone holes ascend in pitch all the way to an A flat just before you switch back to that A tone hole, it meant that you have a fully chromatic range all the way from A1, which is 3 ledger lines below the bass staff, up as high as you care to go. And just to clarify, that note would be considered a pedal A on a euphonium or a low A on the modern tuba. Now, this particular instrument is far from sunshine and rainbows. Leonard brought it into the shop because it was not in playable enough condition for him, and I can't say I blame him at all because it really needed a lot of work. First of all, my boss had to apply several huge patches to the instrument in various locations, including the bell rim, which was cracked. And that's really unfortunate. The bell rim is a very important part of a brass instrument, and once it's been compromised, once it's been snapped in a certain place, a good tech can get it to 90% of its original sound. A really good tech, maybe 95, 97%, but the instrument's never going to play right again once the bell rim has been snapped, and one of those patches had to clamp the bell ring back in place. Unfortunate. We also repositioned several levers and posts and whatnot at Leonard's request so that he could hold it a little bit more easily. But what I principally was entrusted to do on this OPHICLEIDE was to shim the keyholes. Obviously, I'm not nearly, in any sense, the repair person that my boss is at Clearwater Music, but what I do have is a young, supple pair of ears and a good sense of absolute pitch. The shimming process essentially involved me taking strips of cork and applying them to the top or the bottom of a tone hole, depending on which direction I wanted the pitch to go in. So I sat there, testing each tone hole and figuring out what note it was supposed to be and where the pitch center lay, and I would put corks to essentially correct that. And it's a really naff sort of solution, putting strips of cork in place and just gluing them there. It doesn't look great, and you can't really put too many strips down, because first of all, cork's decently expensive if you use too much of it, And secondly, I mean, what, are you going to stack 10 layers of cork, block half the tone hole to try and raise the pitch a certain amount, and then your sound quality is compromised? I also really should emphasize how not excellent the solution was, in the sense that even if I did put a couple layers of cork down, it really was a hopeless endeavor. There are too many inconsistently out of tune notes on this OPHICLEIDE, and the most I could do is if a note was, say, 30 cents flat, and believe me, some of them were, maybe 2 strips of cork would correct 5 to 10 cents of that. Now let's talk about my experiences actually trying to play this crazy beast. I'll give you an anecdote from my high school AP physics class. My teacher walked in one day after we'd taken an exam and he had graded it, and he said, "Your test scores were epic, and not in a good way." That is the camp in which the intonation of this instrument falls. First of all, we are dealing with a horrifically unruly harmonic series. So I'll put a picture up of the notes that you can play on the open horn, again with no keys pressed. That B-flat 1, or the pedal harmonic of the instrument, wasn't too bad. I mean, it was a little stuffy, but what can you really expect from an instrument of this time period? But getting into the bass staff, we're talking B-flat 2, F3, those next 2 notes, they were both really nebulous in terms of their slot. It didn't want to slot anywhere, and those notes were really liable to be quite flat and dead sounding. So pitch and sound were not excellent there. Moving on up to the next B-flat, B-flat 3, and the D4, so we're straddling right near that middle C range on the piano, those were actually decent notes. They had nice slotting and intonation, their clarity was decent enough, and they were overall what you would expect to be able to get out of an instrument. But then the F4 went and ruined it all. It had a good slot and a good amount of projection, but the slot was just in the flat-out wrong place. And I shouldn't say flat-out because it was miles sharp. And that's funny, because the next note you would typically use is not that demented A flat in the harmonic series that sits about 40 cents flat even on a well-designed instrument, but the B flat above that, essentially the fundamental several octaves up. The B flat 4 on this instrument was not a B flat 4. It was an A4, and there was no physical way I could lip it up to the necessary degree without not playing on the open horn. The next soon-to-be-discovered nightmare of playing this instrument was the fact that the key work and the fingering tendencies were inconsistent at best. There's, first of all, very little standardization in the OPHICLEIDE world, and in general, keyed bugles do not share a fingering schema with any woodwind instrument as far as I'm concerned, and it was kind of up to the discretion of the manufacturer to determine which keys led to which tone holes which produced which notes, and so that makes it a real challenge to get your bearings on an instrument like this. There are OPHICLEIDE fingering charts out there that do a decent job for the most part, and the fingerings are generally supposed to be intuitive. Essentially, in order of your fingers moving physically downward, the notes are getting higher because you're using less of the instrument, you're opening it up at a sooner position. The trouble is, some of these tone holes were so innately untuneful that you wouldn't be able to use that particular tone hole for the note it was intended, and you'd have to find some goofy alternate fingering, either by pressing it and adding other tone holes to the mix, or by just finding a different combination of tone holes entirely. I think I spent about 2 hours testing out every single note on the fingering chart that was in Leonard's case, and just making all sorts of amendments. I would say probably 2/3 of the notes I either supplemented with another fingering or two, or I just straight up crossed it out, probably for about 1/3 of the notes, and said, no, use this instead. The fingering listed absolutely sucks. Now, something to note about the instrument is that due to its constantly conical bore profile, the tone holes were not a consistent size all the way through the instrument. Like I said, that left index finger one, the A tone hole, was the biggest one, and then from there they gradually got smaller. Or if you want to think about actually going in sequence with the air of the instrument, the tone holes gradually grew in size out to that last one. And what's funny about this is the tone holes kind of split themselves off into two different camps, largely stratified by which hand was operating those keys. The right hand was operating some of the smaller tone holes, and the left hand some of the larger ones, conversely. And what you ended up with was essentially two different types of keys. The first type, the left-hand type, were what I call boom keys. These keys had a very boomy and powerful sort of sound to them when opened up. They were the least compromising of the instrument's tone quality, and as a result, the tone quality felt more similar to that of the open horn with these tone holes than these ones. But the reason I call them boom keys is not just because of the fact that when they were opened, they sounded nice and boomy, but because they would add extra boom when combined with other tone holes being opened. At the risk of this getting a little hairy for those of us less familiar with keys, technically, if you have a key defining each chromatic tone, you should only ever need to open one tone hole at a time. The trouble is, sometimes you don't get the ideal sound or intonation if you do so. And the reason I called these keys the boom keys is because if I was playing a note that entailed me opening one of these tone holes over here, and I added one of these keys to it, the sound would actually open up and become much more boomy. And so what's kind of goofy is I found myself on a lot of right-hand notes actually opening one or more left-hand tone holes just to get the tone quality to be a little more pleasant. And that brings me to the other type of key on this instrument, what I call the quack key. So thinking about the fact that the open horn is a B flat, and then you press keys on your way down, not this one, but you press the other ones on the way down that raise the pitch all the way up to an A flat. And then obviously you reach an A and you start the pattern over again by closing that one tone hole that stays open by default. The trouble with some of these last keys here associated with notes like F or G or A flat just before you switch back over to the A is the tone holes were very small and they produced an extremely tinny and reedy and pitchy and unpleasant sort of tone. And pressing one or more of the boom keys in conjunction with the quack keys would result in a little bit less quack in the tone, but the trouble is a lot of the time it actually worsened the pitch. And that was essentially the constant battle with this instrument, is as much fun as it was to play, it was not as pleasant to listen to, and I found myself constantly adjusting rather neurotically, and I couldn't get myself to focus on actually making music because of how tricky it was. There might have been 3 or 4 given fingerings for any note, but 1 or 2 of those would be absolutely musically useless, just a complete dud, and then you might get one that had a particularly good sound because it used left-hand keys, and one that had particularly better pitch because it used right-hand keys. You could try and combine them to make it work, but typically it was just a compromise of, do I want good tone or good pitch in this scenario? And I guess I'll briefly touch on the tone of the instrument when it was working properly, because there were so many caveats to that I could barely assess the tone quality. The OPHICLEIDE has a really interesting sound. We think about the modern tuba, and that takes, obviously, boomy to a new level. It's just a massive sound being diffused evenly throughout any size of hall. It's got a decent amount of power to it, but not a lot of bite. If you want bite, you either need a tuba with a directional bell like a cont'd, which adds a little bit of harshness to it, or something like the Italian school's solution to the bass dilemma back in the 1800s, which was the cimbasso, essentially a contrabass trombone with valves. And by the way, a contrabass trombone would be a similarly or analogous solution to the issue. You get a lot more presence in the upper frequencies with those sorts of instruments, and a lot more harshness and bite to the tone, if that's what you want, and just a huge amount of carrying power when pushed. The OPHICLEIDE obviously is not as loud as any modern bass-pitched brass instrument, but it does have a really interesting tone quality. If not naturally slightly reedy and nasally and closed off in some ways, it is a really captivating sound. I can't really tell what the blend of the frequencies is, but it is interesting to use an OPHICLEIDE, or even an OPHICLEIDE in conjunction with a serpent, as Berlioz would have wanted, on certain pieces from the Romantic era, and it really adds an interesting dimension and depth in a situation where the modern tuba might be a little bit too heavy-handed or not nimble enough. think is about where we'll put a bow on our deep dive on the OPHICLEIDE today. I shudder to think how long this video is going to turn out. This is basically trumpet demystified all over again. But to the 1 to 3% of you still sticking around at this point in the video, I really appreciate your time, and I hope it's been a worthwhile and enjoyable experience. This was truly an enjoyment for me. Getting to play that thing was unlike anything I've ever done before, and even though I whined and moaned throughout the duration of this video, it was a lot of fun, and I wish I could go back and play it again. It truly was just amazing to play on something that old and that unusual by today's standards, and it was a lot of fun researching and putting together this video for all of you. Until next time, once again, I really appreciate your time, and we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.